As you know, our first keynote speaker is Dr. Robert Astroff on law school admissions. He's the president of Astroff Consultants, Inc., who received a Bachelor of Arts with great distinction from McGill University, a Bachelor of Laws from Dalhousie University, a Master of Arts from the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, and a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Toronto. Dr. Astroff's expertise covers a broad range of program areas, including applications to law, medical, dental, and business schools, as well as graduate and undergraduate schools in Canada, the US, and overseas. He has assisted thousands of applicants in Canada and abroad in achieving their post-secondary educational and professional goals.
Dr. Astroff has lectured on the admissions process at private schools and universities across Canada and has been featured in Maclaren's, the Toronto Star, the National Post, as well as other radio and media outlets. Prior to founding Astroff Consultants, Dr. Astroff worked as an educator at the University of Toronto and Carleton University and held positions with several government institutions and international organizations, including the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, also known as Global Affairs Canada, and the United Nations. Let's give Dr. Robert Astroff a warm welcome.
So thank you very much for having me this morning. That's a great introduction. I'm so happy to be here. And I really wanted to give a very big thank you to Future Lawyers for putting this conference together. I've had a chance to work with a variety of different organizations over the last year and a half during the pandemic, and putting together a conference of this caliber is a really difficult thing. So a big shout out to the organizing committee for putting this together. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm really excited. As mentioned in the introduction, I've had a chance to work with a lot of different universities, a lot of different private schools, but my favorite venue is actually speaking to young students who were very similar to a position I was in when I started out, and I was in high school. And I remember planning my journey to law school and really not knowing where to start, and starting to ask very similar questions to what you guys are probably asking now. And just having help along the way to achieve those goals was extremely beneficial to me. And this opportunity that the organizers have put together for you is really terrific. I've had a chance to look over the agenda. The speakers are engaging, the speakers are wonderful, and I am sure that you're going to learn a lot, and hopefully you will from this session, which is going to be about the journey toward attending law school. And in order to do that, I'd really like to find out a little bit more information about you before we start. So if you can type into the chat, please, if you're in the early stages of high school, like in grade 9 or grade 10, please type in 1. If you're in the latter stages of high school in grades 10, or sorry, in grade 11 or grade 12, please type in 2. If you've graduated from high school already and maybe even attending university, please type in 3. And that will give me a sense of who you are, where you are in the admissions process, and then I'll be able to tailor my comments accordingly to make this presentation as useful as it can be for you. So I see quite a few people are in the early stages in grade 9 and grade 10. So a variety of people. Okay, so that's great. If you don't mind typing into the chat as well where you're from. If you're from Canada, if you can type in Canada. If you can type in from another country, please name what that might be. That will also give me a sense of who you are and what you're looking for in the presentation. So again, I can better answer your questions. So most of you are from Canada. Okay, that's terrific. Excellent. Okay, so that's great. So let's get started then. Okay, so one more question would be just how do you feel at the moment about admissions? If you know a lot about admissions, please type in 3. If you feel that you sort of know where to start, but you're feeling a little bit anxious, type in 2. And if you don't know where to start at all, which is probably fairly common, feel free to type in 1. So lots of 1s, a few 2s. Okay, very good. So when I was in high school, I remember starting out my own journey to law school. And as mentioned in the introduction, I've had a chance to attend a lot of different universities. The law was always something that I wanted to pursue, and I really didn't know where to start. And I remember starting with my parents, who are very smart people, and they had a lot of really good advice. I remember reaching out to some of my cousins who attended universities that I was interested in, And one conversation in particular was really insightful for me. And I sat down with a cousin of mine, and I really wanted to go to McGill University in Montreal as my undergrad. And I sat down with my cousin, and he went through how to pick courses. And I was just fascinated. I saw this as a chess game. I saw this as something that required a lot of strategy, and it wasn't just randomly picking courses. And I understood at a very early age, this is when I was just before heading off into university, that this is something that I really had to think about and plan effectively in order to reach the goals that I was setting for myself. So that really set in motion what we have here today, which is my company, which I'm now running with my wife. We've been operating this for now 14 years. We've helped thousands of people in a variety of different professions to achieve their professional and their academic goals. And law school has always been a very strong passion of mine, and helping you to achieve your goals is something that I really hope that we can do through this presentation. If you have any follow-up questions afterwards, I will certainly put up my contact information. Happy to help out. It's a very complicated process, but I'm hoping that I can dispel some of the myths today, give you some really good guidance in terms of where you need to go so that you will feel that you're empowered, as was said in the introduction, that you'll feel really good about going off to university for those of you who are not in university yet. For those of you who are in university, you'll know exactly what to do so that you'll know how you can plan your next steps and make this application process as effective as you possibly can. And it's important to note also that it's not just applying to law school. The skills that you'll learn along the way, hopefully some of the skills that you'll learn today, are really very important, not only in terms of admission to law school, but your academic and professional growth. And you'll see these come up again and again and again. So some common reactions, and I'm sure that many of you are feeling this way, is it can be very overwhelming. So again, part of what we hope to do today is to walk through the admissions process, which again is not exactly the same for every single school, but I think you'll see that there are some general trends. It can be very overwhelming, and pressure can increase as you get further along into the process. So the whole purpose is to start early. So if you plan, then you do, and then you reflect, something that we're going to keep coming back to throughout the presentation. I think you're going to find that you'll have greater chances of success in law school and in other academic and professional ventures that you're seeking. So let's start with this chart. This was a chart that was shown to me by a colleague about 2 years ago, so just prior to the pandemic. And I really felt that it sort of helped out with my planning during the pandemic. It certainly helps out with law school applications, and I hope that it will be insightful for you as well. So if you look at the chart, on the left-hand side is where we are today. And then you can see branching off from that, there's 3 different colored lines. So there's a red line that's sloping downward. There's a black line that's parallel, that's flat. And then you can see that there's a blue line that's accelerating upward at an exponential level. So the whole purpose of this chart, if you look at it, we're on here today, the left-hand side. If you are 12 months, 18 months, 2 years out, whenever you're applying to law school, what you really want to do is you want to take small, meaningful, impactful steps starting now. And they may not seem significant. They may seem very small. They may seem very inconsequential. But if you start taking those steps now, you can see what will happen. So if you don't take steps now, the closer you get to the admissions process, you're going to fall off the chart precipitously. So you can see that with the red chart sloping downward. You'll be in a deficit. You won't have a chance to make up really any time. You'll be deficient in activities. You'll be deficient in professional competencies. You'll be deficient in transferable skills, which we're going to talk about. So it's very important that you start. Some people wait a little bit later. They'll start that process a little bit later along the line. That's sort of doing nothing or waiting until later. You'll see that as sort of the black line where you don't see a lot of movement. And status quo is okay for the time being, but it's not okay going forward. But if you take small, impactful, meaningful steps going forward, you'll see that your payoffs at the end will be significant. And that's represented by the sloping upward curve that you see on the blue line. So what we really want is for you to take those small, impactful steps starting today. Our presentation is going to focus on some of the things that you can begin to do now to know the lay of the land so that you know what to expect going forward. And then you'll be able to hopefully be on that blue line and get accepted to law school, get the job of your dreams at a law firm or a governmental organization or an NGO, and really feel good about the whole process that you're developing and professionally and academically. Okay, so our session today is going to cover 4 different areas, and I'm hoping that it will be as interactive as possible. We're going to use chat to try to make sure that happens. But please feel free to drop your comments into the chat. We're going to be around for some questions and answers at the end, but also feel free to drop those questions into the chat, and then we'll try to answer as many as we can toward the end. So I'm hoping to cover 4 different areas today. Number 1, we're going to talk about the law school application process. And again, it won't be the same for every single school, but you're going to see that there are some trends that you can use throughout your planning that hopefully will be universal, and you'll be able to use these tips and tricks to get better and better and better and put yourself in the most competitive position possible. Second, it's really important to understand what the law schools are looking for. So we're going to touch on that briefly. Third, we're going to talk about how you specifically can prepare for the journey ahead. We're going to go through a few different exercises that we feel are very helpful to our clients that hopefully you can use yourself in terms of planning. And then we'll leave some time at the end for some questions. Okay. So we live in a very competitive world. And as you know, law school admissions are extremely competitive. So let's start with a question. So how many of you think that only 10% of people get into law school? How many of you think that 25% of people get into law school of the applicant pool? How many of you think that 50% of the applicants get in? And if you can just type that into the chat. So a lot of number 1s, a few number 2s, and a couple of number 3s. So the answer is that it's between number 1 and number 2. So if you look at a competitive school like Harvard or the University of Toronto, typically those schools will actually admit or matriculate about 10% of the applicant pool. The actual number will be a little bit higher because oftentimes universities will accept more people than they actually know will enroll at the end. Sometimes people will give up on that opportunity to pursue something else. Sometimes they'll choose different schools. So usually they will admit sometimes 15 to 20% of the applicant pool, but those who actually attend are only about 10%. So glass half empty is that 90% of people do not get in. Glass half full is that 10% of people do get in. So the question really becomes, what do you have to do to put yourself in that 10% category where you're going to get accepted, you're going to move on to go and study law, you're going to be able to pursue the career that you really want to go into. That's really the trick. And I'm going to show you how you can do that. And I'm going to try to simplify the application process so that you can see where you need to really concentrate on in terms of your time. So if you can type into the chat also, what do you think are the key aspects of the application process? There's 4 that I'm going to talk about, but I'm curious to see if you know what some of those things are. So just take a moment, please type into the chat, what are the key aspects of the admission process? And then we're going to go through those sequentially. So one person has written down LSATs, marks, personal profile. Letters of reference is another thing that someone's mentioned, LSAT and undergraduate grades, extracurricular grades, LSATs. So you're off to a really good start. So there's basically 4 different areas that I would like to highlight. We're going to be spending most of our time in the area that's highlighted in blue. And you're going to see why that's so in a moment. So number 1 is your transcripts. So high schools calculate your average very differently than most universities. So universities usually use a 4.0 system, meaning that you're scored out of 4 grade points. So roughly speaking, a competitive law school average will be around 80%, which translates to around a 3.6 or a 3.7 out of 4.0. So it's really important to know that. It's really important to be able to choose your courses appropriately and to know what to do in case something happens and you're not doing well in a course, so that you are not in a position where your law school average or your GPA is at a low point, because this is something that's really important. And as you're going to see, most people who are applying to law school and successfully gaining entrance are people who have a fairly high grade point average. Again, 3.5, 3.6, 3.7 is the range that most law schools will start at. I have seen applicants with lower grade point averages get in, and I've obviously seen quite a few students with higher grade point averages go in. The goal is that universities ideally would like to see a perfect average. There are people who can do that. Don't feel that your average has to be perfect, but it certainly has to be at a high point. So I remember starting off as a student, I was 18 years of age. I'm originally from the Maritimes in Nova Scotia, and I was attending school in Montreal, and McGill has a very specific range of courses that first-year students take.
I was studying arts, and it's a very complicated formula where you have to take science courses, you have to take humanities courses, you have to take social sciences courses and language courses. So you have to take a combination of those courses. Psychology, unfortunately, at McGill is both a science and a social science. And even though I had all of my courses approved by an advisor and it was signed off, the advisor unfortunately made a mistake, and the balance of my courses was not as it needed to be. And I found out about this 2 weeks into school. So it was a very nerve-wracking moment for me where I had to sit down, look at all the courses that I was taking, and then make changes to several of the courses. So fortunately, I'd attended a lot of the courses because I was still not 100% sure what I wanted to take. And I had been attending lectures, so that was a saving grace, and I was very lucky with respect to that. But I basically had to rejig my entire schedule 2 weeks in. And because I had planned ahead, because I was organized with choosing courses, because I didn't choose just 5 courses to go into, I was able to sit down in my dorm room, print out all the different syllabi or the schedule for the courses with all the assignments. And over the course of a weekend, I was able to optimize my schedule. I actually turned out with a better schedule than what I had started with. Fortunately for me, I ended up on the dean's list in the first term and throughout my university education. But I was really lucky because if it had been a couple of days in the other direction and I had missed a little bit more in terms of classes, it could have easily gone in the other direction. So it's really important when you're planning, not just to choose the courses that other people tell you that you need to take, really try to think for yourself, look and see what type of courses are there, when the assignments are due, how much the exams are worth, how much the assignments are worth, so that you're comfortable with the breakdown. You obviously don't want to be writing 5 midterm exams in 2 or 3 days. You want to be able to space that out. You want to be able to make sure that your final exam schedule is optimized as well. You want to make sure that all of your papers are due at times when you can actually write and effectively do well with them. So this is all part of the planning process in order to get a good grade. So we won't spend too much time on transcripts because most students who are attending university are going to have a high GPA. So the fact that you have a high GPA will really not differentiate you from other students who are applying to law school, but it is something that's expected, which is why we're talking about this for a few minutes. But really go in, talk to older students, talk to people who've gone through the courses that you're thinking of taking, find out which professors are teaching them so that you can really optimize your schedule, have the best learning experience possible, and end up hopefully with really solid grades that will position you for law school or graduate school or whatever else you're seeking at that time. So the second component is on standardized tests. And for the law school admissions process, that's the law school admissions test. I'm not going to speak too much about this because I know that you have another speaker that's coming up that will speak exclusively about this. But generally speaking, law school admission tests, a good score to have would be around 160 or around the 80th percentile. So I'll leave this discussion for later on and people who focus specifically on that. But the law school admissions process does factor in the LSAT quite significantly as part of the equation. So it's something that no university course will really help you with. There are companies that focus on this. You can learn your skills on your own or do it through them. I would recommend that you shop around, really know what you're getting into, see what their testimonials are like. Ask for other students that have gone through the program. They can be very good programs. And the advantage to going through a program is that you're going to have a cohort of people who are going through exactly the same thing as you are. So that can be very beneficial. However, you can study for this on your own if you seek to, but it's always good to get help along the way. So law school admissions can be quite quantitative in terms of the admission average and the LSAT. Those are two of the larger components of the admissions process. But most people who are going to law school have really solid grades, and most people who are going to law school have very solid LSAT scores. So I would say an average competitive applicant would have around an A- average, around a 3.7, and around a 160 on their LSAT. Okay. Another thing that was mentioned was letters of reference. Letters of reference are extremely important in terms of the law school admission process, but like transcripts, like standardized tests, unfortunately, you're not going to see a lot of differentiation between people who have good letters of reference because you're going to ask people who are going to write you good letters of reference. They're going to provide you, they're going to say nice things about you. That's largely true of everyone. But it is really important in terms of choosing who is that letter of reference, who that referee is going to be. I'm going to tell you a story about my own references when I was going to law school and why they were important. And then we're going to move on to other areas of the application. But I remember when I was applying to law school, the school that I wanted to go to really badly was Dalhousie University, which was a school that I attended. Ultimately, that was my home university. And Dalhousie University is the oldest common law school in the British Commonwealth. Very rich history. They produce Supreme Court justices and prime ministers. And it's a very strong law school in terms of the areas that I wanted to study as well. So my own focus was on health law and medical bioethics, and Dalhousie Law School has one of the strongest programs in the country in that area, and I really wanted to go to Dalhousie. So when I was choosing my referees, I really wanted to choose someone who I felt would be appropriate, someone who knew me well, someone who could speak to my experiences. And the person that I chose was actually a family friend, but someone who I had worked in his lab before. He's a professor of chemistry at Dalhousie, so he knew the university very well. He knew me very well. And I remember asking him for a letter of reference, and he said to me, "I'm happy to write you a letter of reference, but I'd like to see your CV." And I kind of laughed because I said to myself, this is someone who I've known basically since birth. They've known me very well. I've worked under their supervision in their lab. So what more could they possibly want to know? But I learned a very valuable lesson from that story. He said, you come home from McGill, I get to see you, we get to spend a little bit of time together when you're home. But he said, I don't really know what kind of activities you've been up to for the last 3 years. So I gave him a copy of my CV. And he said to me at the time, he said, now I can write you a really good letter of reference. He said, I could have written you a good one before, but he said, now I really know what you've done in university. And I see why some of the things that you've been doing in high school have been added to and extended when you were in university. So I learned a very valuable lesson that the people who are writing letters of reference for you, whether they're professors or mentors in other capacities, will probably know you very well in the capacity that they've worked with you, but they probably will not know you very well in your other capacities. So if you are a good student and you're asking someone who is a mentor of yours outside the academic context to write you a letter of reference, you should give them a copy of your transcript. If you're in the academic context, you should give someone a copy of your resume. It's always good to put a file together, and we're going to talk about the different components of the file in a moment, but it's always really good to put that together, give someone all the information that they need to know to write you a strong letter of reference, and then offer them the opportunity to speak with you. So I've had the opportunity also to write a lot of letters of reference. So one of the things that I did prior to starting this company is I worked as an educator, as a teaching assistant at the University of Toronto, where I did my PhD, and also at Carleton, where I did my master's degree. And I wrote a lot of letters of reference, either for professors on behalf of students or for students who wanted me to write them the letters of reference. And oftentimes I didn't really know the students very well because both of those universities are fairly large places. And students would come to me and they would say, can you write me a letter of reference? And I would say, I'm happy to do that, but I really don't know you very well. Can you come to my office hours, bring a copy of your CV, bring a copy of your application, and I'll get to know you and your academic and career goals a little bit more. And then I'll be able to write something that's more effective. The last thing in the world that you want is someone to write you a generic reference, because at the end of the day, a letter of reference is an important component to getting into law school, but it's expected by the admissions committee that it's going to be at a very high caliber. So if it's not at a high caliber and it's very general, that can actually do more harm than good. So carefully think about it. Usually law schools ask for 2 or 3 different letters of reference. You should try to get a professor to write at least one of them. Law schools, after all, are academic institutions. They want to see how you're doing in school. So someone who can speak to your academic prowess would be very good. People who can also speak to your character. People outside the academic context are also good, but they should be people who have recently observed you and have been able to supervise you in your role. Those are things that are really important. So those are the top 3 things that most people believe are part of the admissions process. They are all important. They will all open the door for you. But at the end of the day, if you think about it carefully, most people who are successful in terms of getting into law school will have high grade point averages. Most people who are applying to law schools will have high LSAT scores, and most people who are applying to law school will have excellent letters of reference. So at this point, every single person who's applying to law school is very similar. So there's a lot of uniformity to that cohort. Most people who are applying to law school are high achievers, so you have good grades. Most people are really ambitious So they've studied hard for their LSAT and done well. Most people are really well-rounded, so they've gone and done extracurricular activities and volunteer activities and other things that we're about to talk about. So you can have a fairly well-rounded letter of reference. But the key is to really try to focus on a few main areas, and that's largely in the written component of the application. So there's two main components to that. One are called personal statements or application essays, and the second is your CV or your autobiographical sketch. It's also really important to know something that is not mentioned on this, and that most law schools do not interview people. So I'm a lawyer by training. I've helped people to prepare for law school applications, and we've successfully helped thousands of people over the years. In terms of law firm interviews, we've done a lot. I've helped a lot of people successfully get jobs in firms and even go on to judgeships. But in terms of law school interviews, there are probably less than 10 that I've done over the course of the years because they simply don't happen at this stage. That's not to say that they won't happen, but throughout my career, interviews are really not an important focus of law school admissions committees. I've seen them on a handful of occasions, but typically they're for special students in different categories, people who come from a different background or people who are mature students. We typically do not see regular applicants being interviewed. There's simply too many applicants for the law schools to go through. So what does that mean for you? It means that if people have similar grades, similar LSAT scores, and similar letters of reference, you really have to focus on the written component of the application and excel on that in order to stand out. So that's what we're really going to focus on for the duration of our presentation today. So the written component of the application is called many things. It's called the personal statement. It's called an application essay. It's called a brief personal essay. It can be called an impact statement. A statement of intent is sometimes what they're called. They're really all just answering questions about why you want to go to law school and what are your specific experiences that will help you to stand out and make a valuable, significant, meaningful contribution to the law school. So that's one area that we're going to talk about a little bit. So again, an example of this would be, why do you want to study law at University X? And I put in X university for a specific reason, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but it's very important that your law school applications are not generic and that you're not just filling in the blanks for different universities. It's very important that you actually write your application for each individual university so that they know why you're going to be a good fit and why you can make a meaningful, significant, and positive contribution to their class. Another variation of an application essay might be to explain how your academic, personal, and/or work experiences have contributed to your development as an individual and prepared you for the study of law. So one is a more general question, one is a little bit more focused. I find that most universities really give you the space and the ability to talk about a lot of different things, and they don't really give you a lot of structure. There are some universities like the University of Windsor, which really give very specific questions. So instead of asking you to write one big essay, they'll ask you to write 4 or 5 really short essays. So once you've figured out which universities you want to apply to, it's always good to start with the more specific ones first, write those out, and then you can use parts of those essays to create a more cohesive, broader essay for the schools that are requiring a longer essay rather than specific ones. The autobiographical sketch is also something that's important. This is more like a resume. It's called a CV, a resume, a list of activities, or an ABS. And this is really just your list of activities. This can be a very challenging document to put together. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, largely because your space is really constrained. So in some areas, in some schools, they will give you very limited space to write about your achievements and accomplishments. So it might be as little as 150 characters with spaces. We've seen that before, where you have to write about what you did and why it was important to you in less than 150 characters. So it's with spaces. So it's the equivalent of writing a tweet. So you may have volunteered at a law firm, you may have had significant work experience or a volunteer experience that you really want to talk about. And the autobiographical sketch component is really just a list of what you've done, but you can be very precise. There's a lot of information, believe it or not, that can be conveyed in 150 characters or less. We will show you some of the ways that you can do that over the course of our presentation today so that you can see how to do that. But it's really important that you start compiling information about yourself so that you know what you've done and done well and what you need to do to improve in terms of filling gaps. So the language for this might look like something as follows: provide biographical information about yourself and outline your activities following your graduation from high school. So typically, although not always, typically universities, law schools will look at activities that you've done after you've graduated from law school. That's not to say that they won't look at things that you've done in law school. If you've done something really significant, let's say organizing a conference like this, that might be something that you might be able to get in. However, what they're really looking to see is that you've established a good foundation and then built on that in university. So for example, if you're heavily involved in high school activities, which is really good, but then you're not involved in any university activities, that can be very problematic. So you really want to make sure that you're going through and doing all of those things and building on the things that you learned in high school and then extending those in university. But basically what you're going to see is that over time in high school, typically people have quite a bit of time and you can be involved in a lot of different activities. In university, it's actually quite different. You'll have time, but you'll have less time typically than you do now. So you have to choose less activities. In law school, you'll have even less time. So what they really want to see is that people can make the progression from high school to university, still take on a lot of different activities, still maintain a high grade point average, and then do really well at the end. So they're trying to project how you're going to perform in law school. Okay, so here is what law schools mostly are looking for. So what I would do is I would write out each of these things and I would begin to audit your own experiences. So number one is formal education. That's simply going to be where you attended high school and where you're going to university. If you've happened to take a year abroad, if you're taking summer courses, any of your post-secondary work would be reflected on your application. So that's usually fairly straightforward. Extracurricular activities are ones that you do with groups. So they're organized activities that you do with other people. A university club, like the pre-law club at your university, would be an excellent example of an extracurricular activity. So that's an important category there. Volunteer activities are usually things that you seek out and do on your own. So for example, if you're interested, let's say in health law, maybe you volunteered at a hospital. So if you've gone out and volunteered at the IWK hospital in Halifax or the Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, and you've done that on your own, that's something that you could put down. That would be considered a volunteer experience. So something that you initiate on your own. Work experiences are things that are done for pay. So things that are done for pay, it doesn't have to be a significant, meaningful position with a large, impressive title. Everybody's got to start somewhere. So anything that you've done for pay is significant because it has a different weighting than volunteer or extracurricular activities because someone has designated that your work is important. They paid you for it, and you have a different level of responsibility than typically is associated with extracurricular and volunteer work. So that's something that's important as well. Awards and achievements is a pretty broad category. Most people gravitate toward academic awards like being on the dean's list in university or the honor roll in high school. If you win a scholarship, that would be something that you could put down as well. That would be important to consider. However, awards and achievements go well beyond that. So you can, if you wish, talk about things that you've done outside of the classroom. So you can put down if you're a swim instructor or a lifeguard, that would be an award and achievement. If you've done musical training formally through, let's say, the Royal Conservatory of Music, if you're Canadian, would be something that you could put down. If you're a tennis coach or a ski coach, or if you've won some sort of award, consider putting that down as well. It shows that you're well-rounded. Research is something that can be considered also. Most students don't have a lot of research, but it can be something that demonstrates your ability to work with other people and the ability to be really precise. And then you have a category called other. Other is simply everything that doesn't fit into the previous 6 categories. But examples might be any personal travel that you've engaged in, which shows cultural sensitivity, curiosity, and other transferable skills. If you speak another language is an important consideration as well. Canada is an extremely multicultural country. You're going to be dealing with coworkers and friends and colleagues and clients someday who are from a variety of different backgrounds. So if you speak another language, that's really helpful, and that will really help to accentuate your application as well. So even if you only speak a language at home, let's say your parents are from another country, you speak that language at home, I would consider putting this down on your application because it highlights diversity in terms of your skill set. So what I would do now is I would start by doing a personal audit of yourself, write down each one of these categories, And then in bullet form, write down where you are. Some of you may have a lot of experience in each one of these categories, which is terrific, but you'll probably see that you're deficient in some of them. And that's a good thing. At this stage in life, it's a good thing to see where you're deficient because time is on your side. I would much rather know I don't have a lot of volunteer activities and I'm going to have to seek that out in university in order to really do well in my law school application, and know that now where you have several years to plan and incorporate that into your schedule, rather than to find out that you didn't get into law school because you don't have a well balanced portfolio of different activities that you've been involved with. So I would strongly consider it's a great activity to do after this conference. When you've heard speakers talk about the legal career, which is a wonderful career, you're going to have all of these components to be a well-rounded candidate. So it's better to know now. So you've always been told if you plan ahead, it usually produces good results. Investments are a really good way to think about that. If you want to be a millionaire someday, you can't just plan for that the day before. You have to make sure that you plan significantly, start saving, and then over time, your interest will accumulate and you'll have that investment at the end. But you have to start planning. So the key to doing well on a law school application is to plan ahead. So some of the things that I've mentioned also in terms of skills that you want to think about are soft skills. Law schools are looking for good experiences, but they want to see and hear how you've done with those experiences. So let's say that you're a lifeguard. Lifeguarding has absolutely nothing to do with law school on the face of it, but somebody who's a lifeguard is a good communicator because you're relying on other people when you're working together as a team. So you're also a good collaborator. You may be a swim instructor and talking to young students, so you're a good communicator. You may be showing good judgment in terms of talking to parents when you're writing up report cards. So there's all kinds of different skills that you can transfer from experiences that you have now, which may not have anything to do with law school, that will help you in the future. So I think that that's really important. So you always want to think about what are the soft skills that law schools are looking for, what are professionals looking for. These are the skills that you're going to see time and time and time again. You're going to keep coming back to them. So I have a resume going back to 5th grade. I don't use it for anything really than just a list right now, but I can see that I was building those skills that I'm currently using now, obviously in a much different capacity than I'm using them now, but it was started at a very early age. And those skills were developed and honed over time, and they've really helped me as a professional. So again, as you're going through this, I think that there are 3 things that you really want to do. You want to determine where you want to go. So you want to plan. You want to review where you are now and identify gaps. So that's do. And then you want to develop a plan about how to get there. That's reflecting on what you've done and getting there. So always looking at that, always coming back and thinking plan, do, reflect. Plan, do, reflect will always take you to where you need to go. Specifically, you want to develop a roadmap that will help you toward your goals. You want to start compiling your list of activities as we've discussed, and then look for weak areas and then try to build on them. Okay, so here's another exercise that I find is extremely helpful in terms of our clients and their planning. This is something that will help you to flesh out and make that connection between where you're deficient or even where you're strong and what are those transferable skills. And we call this our Astroff memory matrix. It can be extended on either of the axes, but I'm going to give you something very basic that you can think about that will be a really good starting point as you begin your journey in terms of planning for law school. So if you look at the vertical column of the matrix, I put down 4 different professional competency roles that I think are really helpful in terms of going forward, what you're going to need to do. There are obviously many more. We've identified 13 different competencies that we think are important. But for the sake of this presentation, we're just going to focus on 4. So communication, collaboration, advocacy, and leadership. I'm sure when all of you think of a law student or a lawyer, these are common traits that would come to mind. Communication, collaboration, advocacy, and leadership. So on the horizontal column of the matrix, we have different experiences that you no doubt have gone through. Your work experiences, your family and friends, your volunteer activities, your extracurricular activities, and others. And the whole goal of this chart is to try to fill it out and to create, it doesn't have to be filled out completely, but to have a few different examples of when you were a good communicator, a few different examples of when you demonstrated strong teamwork or collaboration skills, when you demonstrated advocacy and when you acted as a leader. So if you don't have it, that's a really good sign. I need to start seeking these things out. So maybe join a university club in first year where you won't be the leader, but in second year, maybe you can be class representative. And in third year, you can be the vice president. And maybe in fourth year, you can be the president. So you're demonstrating longitudinal development, and you're getting better and stronger as you go through that over the course of time. So the idea with this memory matrix is to state what you did, to state what you learned from that particular experience. And then the really important part is to think about what you've done and why that's important in terms of any future activities that you're going to be engaging in. So for example, none of you at this point have worked in a law firm because you're not lawyers. But you're going to have to think about, why was that experience organizing this conference? Why was that experience as a lifeguard? Why was that important in terms of my development? And how will that help me when I do get into law school, when I do become a lawyer? And that's really important, because if you can tie those things together, you're really going to make a huge impact in terms of your application. So you want to start thinking about now, what work experiences can I become involved with? What are my volunteer activities? What are my extracurricular activities? What have I done personally that demonstrate these transferable skills? So you want to start now. Don't think that you only have to focus on academic things. It can be extracurricular, volunteer, and work experiences also. They all show transferable skills. So it's important also, once you've done your due diligence and you've done the reflection about yourself, it's really important to understand the nature of the questions that you're being asked. And you always want to make sure that you're being focused and specific and personal in any of the responses that you're giving. But if you've done your work and you've created a memory matrix and you've started planning ahead, and you've looked at what the bumps are perhaps in the road ahead, you can avoid a lot of the obstacles that come up. And that's what we're going to focus on now. So you really want to make sure that you research the unique aspects of each school. So as you're going through your law school admissions process, you're not just applying to law school, you're applying to a particular law school. So when I was applying to Dalhousie Law School, I knew that I was really interested in business, and I knew that I was really interested in health law and medical bioethics. Dalhousie has a health law institute. They were bringing in some really impressive professors that I knew that I wanted to work with. There were two people in particular that I really knew that I wanted to work with. I wrote my essay about my interest in the area, and I wrote why I felt I would be a good fit at Dalhousie based on the fact that there were professors that I knew I wanted to work with and classes that I knew that I wanted to take. I think that that really made a difference in my application, because I wasn't just applying to law school, I was applying to Dalhousie Law School, which did have a specific specialty in this area. They did have a strength in this area, and I think that they saw that I really would be a good fit because I had done my groundwork and I had done a good job in terms of convincing the admissions committee on my application why I would be a good fit. So that's something that's really important as you're going through as well. When you're going through and you're writing, I think that it's really important to go through a sequential, methodical, logical way of writing. And basically what you want to do is go through our process, which we call BOW: brainstorm, outline, write, and edit. I'm just going to briefly talk about that, show you a few examples, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So brainstorming is, before you write, you have to think, I only have a short amount of time. And as I've mentioned to you, law school admissions are very narrow in terms of only looking at grades, only looking at LSATs, only looking at letters of reference, all of which are very similar. And you're only going to have a document, which can usually be about 1,000 words, sometimes even less, that's going to have to convince the admissions committee why you're a good fit. So if you only have that and you don't have a chance to interview, you really need to know what it is that you want to write. So I think it's important to really have a good idea about, if you only had 5 minutes, which is about the time that it's going to take for someone to go through and answer and read through your document, what would you really want them to know? And I think it's really important to also seek advice from other people. So one of the groups of people that I sought advice from were my parents. My parents really know me very well, obviously, and they were able to kind of think holistically about the application. I thought that there were a few things that I really wanted to mention. They were very specific. One of the things that is a tradition in my family is that in your 4th year of university, you do a big event, usually a big athletic event. So I chose to run the New York City Marathon, which is something that I still have good memories about today. I've participated in other endurance events, so that's always a really good memory for me. My parents said, why don't you write about that experience in your law school application? And at the time, I didn't think about it, but after I reflected on it and ultimately did use it in my application, I thought, you know what, I've had to problem solve through running, because running is not something that is my favorite sport, but I thought it was a good challenge. I had to run through a number of different injuries and figure out a number of just different logistical concerns. So I was able to show that I was a good problem solver through my approach to marathon running, which I think, again, made my application a little bit unique, because I was talking about things that weren't necessarily on the face of it related to law school, but I was able to make that connection. So seek advice from other people and think about what you would want to write about in about 5 minutes. Then you want to outline your points. I think it's really important to have a roadmap about what you're writing, and not just to throw it up. You want to make sure that you have a very sequential, logical way of relating your experiences together. Ideally, you want to talk about 2 or 3 different experiences and not more than that, depending on the length of the essay, of course. But if you overwhelm people with detail, they will not understand what you're trying to write, and you won't have time to go through a really good essay where you're going to talk about what you did, what it is that happened, and what you learned that's transferable into the future. All of those things are really important. So you have to think about what are the stronger points, a small number of points that you want to do, and then go through it. I think that that's all really important. You want to make sure that you're writing your essay also as effectively as possible. And when you write your essay, you really want to start, I think, with your introduction and your conclusion. The introduction is a roadmap of what you're going to write. And believe me, law school admissions committees look at thousands of different applications, and a lot of the applications can look a lot alike. You will have a good understanding of what it is that you want to write about. However, the admissions committee will not necessarily know that. If you have a good introduction that says that you want to do X, Y, and Z, and then you actually do X, Y, and Z, that can make a huge difference in terms of writing a good essay and ultimately getting accepted to law school. So I remember in my own case writing about lawyers being compassionate, lawyers being very precise, and lawyers being very hardworking. And I used each of those examples to show different things in my own history that had demonstrated that I had had each of those qualities. And I was able to incorporate that into my essay, but it was very clear at the beginning by telling a story about why those things were important. I was working for a governmental organization at the time, and I had a chance to work with a lot of different lawyers. And I said, in my work in this area, I saw that lawyers had those 3 qualities. And then I was able to relate those qualities to myself. But it was a highly structured essay. The admissions committee knew exactly what I was trying to write about. And it was very easy for me to then make the case for myself. The end paragraph, of course, is going to be a tie-in, a summary. You're going to talk about why you're a good fit at each of the universities. But all those things I think are important. And then finally, make sure that you edit your essay. Obviously, read it through yourself several times, but bring in different groups of people. Bring in your family and friends. Bring in professors who may know you, but not as well as your family and friends. Bring in other people. Like we happen to edit a lot of different essays. We can be very objective, and I can say to a client, this may make sense to you, but I don't understand what you're trying to say, and you need to clarify it, and this is how you do it. So you want to make sure that you're doing all of those things. So those are important points. In terms of common pitfalls, I think there are a few that you need to think about. Number one, you want to make sure that you're writing about the things that you really want the admissions committee to know about you, and don't fall into the trap. Please don't fall into the trap about writing about what you think the admissions committee wants to know about you. You simply don't know. I've worked in the field for 14 years, and I can obviously identify a lot of different trends based on dealing with thousands of different clients. But at the end of the day, you don't know what the person who's reading it, the actual reviewer of the file, you don't know what they're thinking and what they want. So I always advise clients to take that off the table completely, and to make sure that you're really focused on what you want the admissions committee to know about. Second major error is lack of substance. That should be avoided altogether. And if you plan ahead, fortunately, most of you are at the early stages, that should be avoided at all costs. So it's by building your profile, identifying what those gaps are and filling that. You always want to make sure that you have something substantive to say. And as I mentioned to you before, it doesn't necessarily have to be that you worked in a law firm or that you have a relationship with a judge. Very few people do that because law firms know that you don't have the skills to work in that law firm yet. You'll be doing largely clerical things that won't be really even legal related. You can get a lot of those skills by doing other things. So you really want to focus on the quality of your experiences so that you can talk about substantive matters in your application essays. From a more tactical perspective, I think it's really important to avoid cliches, which are overused expressions, and avoid statements that are superficial. And instead, you want to be precise and personal if you can be. So let me show you a few different examples. So the first one that we're going to highlight here is this experience taught me about the importance of leadership. So you may be a very strong leader, but at the end of the day, you really aren't saying a lot about yourself. So take a look at this, which is a much stronger version of what I just had. As the president of the Student Society, I led a team of 10 committee members that initiated and organized a rally to increase funding to undergraduate students. So I know by looking at that you're the president, so that you have a very high level of involvement in your student organization. I know that you've led a team of 10 people, so it's a medium-sized team. It's not a team of 1 or 2. It's also not a team of several hundred. And I know what you've done in terms of the process of becoming involved in your activity, that you've organized a rally, that you've helped undergraduate students. It's a fairly specific piece of information. So now I can really sink my teeth into your application and know what it is that you've done, whereas the first example does not. Here's another example. During my employment, I learned about the importance of teamwork. So I don't know in this particular case what the person did, and I don't know how they functioned as a team. So here's a more precise example. A lot of you may have worked at summer camps. So in my position as a section head at Camp X, I met regularly with my staff to discuss areas of improvement for the camp program and implemented their recommendations where appropriate. So I know in this particular case that this person was a section head, so they have a fair bit of responsibility. I know that they have supervised staff. They're encouraging people to become involved in meetings. So they're a good leader because they're relying on the opinions of other people. And they're saying at the end that I implemented their recommendations where appropriate. So it doesn't mean that they always implemented the recommendations. It's saying where appropriate. So they're using their judgment and acting as a leader. So I really like that example. If someone said I worked as an overnight counselor, that might be even better in this particular example, because overnight camp counselors have a little bit of a different responsibility because they're responsible for kids 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as opposed to people who are working between 9 and 5 at a day camp. If you put in the age of the kids, that would be even more specific as well. So there's always room for improvement, but you really want to be as specific as you possibly can be. Here's another example. I'm a hardworking individual. Better way to say that is over my last semester at McGill, I maintained a full course load. So we know that this person is carrying on 5 courses, in addition to my duties as the president of the Young Liberal Society and my employment at Starbucks. So this person is heavily involved in extracurricular activities. They're taking a full course load. They're involved in their employment at Starbucks. I know as a law school admission member, or I know as a prospective employer in the future, this person is a really good time manager, something that is really important in law school and something that's really important in the future as a professional in a law firm or an NGO or in the government, where you're really being relied upon to manage your time and finish projects in a timely way. It's also important to be really precise. So just type into the chat if you can, how many mistakes you see in this particular example. So just type that in quickly. Always check your spelling. So just type in the number 1 or 2 or 3 or how many different things you see. Good, so I'm seeing a lot of 2s. There are 2 mistakes that I can see right away. So always is really easy, that's spelled wrong, and that's going to be picked up on a spell checker. The second mistake is a more grammatical one. So it says always check your spelling. Y-O-U_R-E, which means you are spelling. So even though it sounds like your, it's actually you are, and that's an inappropriate use of that word. Someone who doesn't accurately check their documents, unfortunately, is not demonstrating precision. And I learned very early on, I remember contracts class in first day of contracts, looking over a case where a comma had been misplaced. A comma had been misplaced. Obviously, the difference in a comma can be very important in a contract. Be it for the value of money or even the placement in a sentence, it's extremely important that lawyers are precise. So make sure that you're being precise. Here's another more difficult example. Can you type in the mistake that you see here? How many mistakes you see and what those might be? So how many mistakes do you see in this particular example? Okay, so there are, I see some 1s, I see some 2s here. There's actually 2 mistakes here. So it's my dream to attend an Ivy League school. So it's obviously an Ivy League school. So IVY, not Ivory League, even though you can be in the ivory tower if you're attending an academic institution. The Ivy League set of schools are a specific set of schools in the United States that are usually very high in terms of their academic caliber. And there's a mistake also in terms of the spelling of the word league. it's spelled correctly, but it should be capitalized. So anybody that's applying to a school like Harvard or Yale, one would hope that you would know what the Ivy League is and spell it correctly. So admissions committees are looking for precision, and they don't want to be distracted. It should be a starting point that you're not going to make mistakes on your application essay. It should be checked multiple times. So remember, at the end of the day, you really want to look at the frequently overlooked aspects of the application, which are the written components. You're not going to stand apart based on your grades. Even if you have a 4.0, that's not going to make the difference. You're not going to necessarily stand apart only because of the LSAT. High LSAT can certainly help, but it won't make the difference usually in terms of you getting into law school. A letter of reference also is expected to be good. So you're really not differentiating yourself on any of those metrics. So you really have to focus on the written component because typically there are no interviews. So there should be a focus on the activities that you choose. You want to make sure that your entries are clear and concise. You want to make sure that you're focused on a small number of activities rather than larger ones, and ensure that your document is error-free. So I'm going to actually just skip over this section and just go to the end. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll turn it over to any questions that you may have. But at the beginning, I asked you how you felt. Hopefully at this point, a lot of you feel a little bit more empowered. I hope that you feel a little bit better about the situation. You know that there is a path to getting into law school. You just have to start early, anticipate what those obstacles are. And if you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer it. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today. I remember my own journey to law school. When I was starting out in high school, I remember very fondly what that was. So please feel free to ask any questions you may have. I'm happy to spend the duration of our time answering those questions.
I'm just gonna, I know there were questions in the chat, but I just wanted to unmute and say that that was literally so good, like so good. I've been to so many of these talks, and that was really quite, it was no nonsense. So I really appreciate it.
Good. It's always good to know what the straight goods are at the end of the day. And really, honestly, I remember very clearly what it was like to be in a position where I was 17 or 18 and thinking about university and feeling very overwhelmed. We made a career out of building this process out so that it can be sequential and logical, and so that there is a path and there's a predictable path. If you take certain steps, you likely will achieve success. So I'm glad that it's no nonsense, and I'm glad that it was helpful.
Absolutely. So for my question, I picked up on the fact that you've actually been to many universities, and some of which I've actually been thinking about myself. In particular, between McGill, Dalhousie, and U of T. I was wondering, I know you went for those for different reasons, but what did you feel like in the academic environment? How did you feel most, I suppose, nurtured? What was your experience with those different schools?
So I had a really good experience at all four of the universities that I attended. I actually have attended 6 different universities. 2 of them were as visiting students, but of the 4 that I actually graduated from, they were very different experiences. So McGill was my first love. I always wanted to attend McGill. My grandfather actually attended McGill as a student a long time ago. And unfortunately, because it was during the Depression, he had to work and he had to leave university. He always told me what a wonderful experience it was. And it was always my dream to kind of follow in his footsteps. A lot of my cousins who are a little bit older than me also attended McGill. And I really had a wonderful experience from beginning to end with McGill. Can't speak highly enough about it. It was a wonderful academic experience as an undergrad. When I was looking for law school, I gravitated to Dalhousie because of my interest in health law and medical bioethics. So at the time, there were only a couple of schools that really were strong in that area. And now a lot of schools have programs in that area. And I don't want to diminish the impact of any of those schools, but Dalhousie, in my opinion, and the University of Alberta at that point were bar none the best schools in the country in terms of that level of training. So Dalhousie was home for me. I had been away for 4 years at university. I knew the professional school was going to be really serious. So I was okay with moving back home and really having a very serious experience for professional school and not being away from home. So that was something that attracted me, but it was largely because of the academics, and I knew what I wanted to do with my professional degree. Carleton was a little bit different. It was a very specialized program in international relations. And my PhD at U of T was because I knew I wanted to work with a very specific set of researchers. So my own research is in political science. So I study international law and political psychology. That's my area of expertise before I started this business. Now it's in admissions.
which we've been doing now for 14 years. And there was a very specific set of people that I wanted to work with. And U of T was the only university in the world that had that level of knowledge. So when I wrote my application, it was very specific to work with that set of researchers. I had a wonderful experience. But to answer your question, when I applied to university initially, I was looking at 4 different schools. I looked at Dalhousie, I looked at McGill, I looked at Western, and I looked at U of T. And I found that my top choices at that point were U of T and McGill. And I chose McGill because it was a smaller school. U of T, even though it's a wonderful school, was a little bit overwhelming for someone who comes from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and was in a class of 25 people. I couldn't imagine being in a class of let's say close to 1,000 people. At McGill, it was a little more manageable. My classes were several hundred people in first year, and I loved it. And at the end of the day, I really enjoyed being in a large university. So I wanted that experience as an undergrad. So I hope that answers your question.
That was really helpful. Thank you.
I guess we can read off another question from the chat.
Sure.
And I guess a lot of people have been asking, how much do high school marks or high school programs affect admissions into law school or graduate schools? And I guess how much of that carries over in the application?
So in terms of marks specifically, very little. So the good news is it's sort of a blank slate usually when you start university. If you've won a major prize in high school, that might be something that you want to talk about. If like at the beginning, I know that a lot of the conference organizers for this are high school students. If this continued on to university, that might be a great example of something that's university where you're mentoring younger students, but you're doing essentially the same activity. So marks usually are from university and onward. And the reason why is that there's a lot of differentiation between different high schools. So when my parents were in university or were thinking about university, basically it was a 3-year program. Now they're all 4-year programs. The first year of university is largely to make sure that you're ready for second-year university. So in Quebec, as an example, students come directly from CEGEP and they go into their first year of university, which would be the second year of the program, and they finish with a 3-year degree because they do junior college. So there's an equivalency in first year because there's so much differentiation. They have to make sure that students are ready. So I find that first year is really just an extended version of high school. It's obviously more challenging for most people. There's a social component. There's not as much handholding. So it's a good way of adjusting to university, but I find that the biggest adjustments are usually social and not academic. The biggest changes are usually in second year. So I think people find that a surprise when they do very well in first year university and then tend to drop off in second year. So to answer your question, most universities, in fact, all the ones that I've dealt with over the years, I can't remember a university at the professional school level looking at a high school transcript. So that would be different if you're applying to a direct entry program. So some people apply, for example, directly to medical school right out of high school, where obviously your high school transcript would be very relevant because that's what they're making the determination on. But really, it's what you've done lately, what you've done over the last 2 or 3 or 4 years that really makes a big difference. So your grade 12 marks, if you apply in fourth year, are 4 years previously, and it's really not that indicative of how well you do. So let's say that you are on the honor roll in high school, but you're not in university. It's not really that significant anymore. So they really want to see how well you performed in university. Obviously, students who do well in high school can translate that to university, but you really want to make sure that you're focused on doing well in university. The actual marks that you get in high school are really not so relevant once you go on.
Just a follow-up on that one, because people have been asking about specific programs. So I guess when you're applying to law school abroad, would IB, AP, or these sort of programs help you?
They can. I mean, at the end of the day, the best advice is that cream always rises to the top. So if you're a good student, you're probably going to perform. But at the end of the day, law schools are looking for a solid average. So if you're taking IB or AP courses, that's not really going to help in terms of law school, but it will help in terms of getting into university. So you have to think about, are my marks going to suffer a lot by going into this program? If they are, for certain university programs, you need a 90% average. Most university programs do not require that. Most university programs, at least in Ontario, where I live and work, it's pretty straightforward. Some university programs will require application essays and other things. But to your question about AB or IP degree, those types of programs, you really want to make sure that you're not diminishing your academic results. So if you're going to excel in an AP program or you're going
going to excel in an IB program, that's great. Though all things being equal, if you can achieve the same marks in those programs, then that will help to differentiate you. However, if you're going to do worse as a result of taking IB or AP courses, then you really have to think about whether you're going to make the minimum standards that are necessary to get into competitive university programs. So it's always context dependent, but you really have to ask yourself, is this going to just give me greater education? I'm going to end up doing about the same as I would ordinarily, then go ahead and take those programs. If you feel that your marks are going to drop off, then you run the risk of not necessarily getting into the programs that you're choosing. So you always want to make sure that you're challenging yourself. I think that's really important. But at the end of the day, marks are an important component about getting into university and certainly about getting into professional school. So in university, obviously choose those courses carefully. With respect to high school and AP or IB courses, you have to just make sure that you're not falling off. You're still meeting those minimum requirements to get into your desired program.
Okay, thank you. Another question, I guess I'm going to combine a few questions. Someone asked, can you do an undergrad in a different country before getting your JD in Canada? And also, are there any undergraduate programs that you do that might diminish your ability to get into law school?
So those are really good questions. I think usually what schools will look for, you can take your degree elsewhere. So especially if you're going to a really good school, there's some students who will take an undergraduate degree, let's say in the United States at an Ivy League school. Clearly, that's not going to have an impact in terms of you getting in. It may actually enhance your ability of getting in, all things being equal. If you go abroad, you study in an English program, like an English language program, generally speaking, that's not a problem. The problem really comes in when you're studying another language. And then you have to get into conversion of your grade point average. You have to go through conversion of the syllabi that you've gone through, so law schools have an idea of what you've studied, and it can become a lot more complicated. So typically, we see most applicants who have studied, who are going into law school, are coming from programs where they've studied in English. I'm not saying you have to study English, the subject, but you would be studying in English, and your grades would not have to be translated. So you should look at that. It's a serious consideration when you're going abroad. It's nice to be able to have that experience. I myself studied in another country for a year of my undergraduate program, and a year of my graduate program. My PhD was spent in another country, and it was a hugely enriching experience. However, I do know admissions would be much more complicated if I had done my entire degree in that country in another language. With respect to the second question, are there specific fields that people need to study to go into law school? The nice thing is that most law schools that we work with, and in fact, I'm hard pressed to think of any examples at the moment, are really not looking for specific required courses. So you can study economics and political science, which is what I studied. You can study history, you can study anthropology, you can study sociology, you can study really whatever you want. They want to see that you have a high level of performance, but typically there's not a required course to get into law school. So you should study what you like, study what you feel passionate about, but you should check to see that there aren't any requirements. We usually go through that exercise every year. Just to make sure that the schools that we deal with are not changing their admission requirements, which can change every year. But generally speaking, law schools do not have any required courses. Some courses, like writing courses, are always good to take. Courses that involve a lot of reading are really good. So my first major was in economics, and I went on and I also studied political science, so I combined the major. Economics, I think, is really good in terms of logical, critical thinking, but the readings for economics are usually a chapter in a textbook, and there's a lot of math that's involved in that. Political science, however, is something that requires a lot of reading. So in law school, you're going to be doing a lot of reading. So I would recommend that you get used to the workload by taking something that requires a fair bit of reading and writing. But that really can be in any subject.
And I guess we can go on to a question about the differences in Canada, the US, and abroad. So somebody asked whether it is worth the effort, or I guess, is it difficult to do your JD in Canada and work as a lawyer abroad, or vice versa? And how does that work in different systems that have direct entry programs into law?
So that's a really good question, and it depends on the context. It depends on your ability to do a lot of different things, which I'll comment on briefly. So number one, it's really important when you're choosing law school to think about where you want to practice.
because it will be easier for you most likely to find a job in the city or area that you're practicing in. So for example, I studied at Dalhousie University, which is in Halifax. Almost all of my classmates were employed in the Maritimes. So in Nova Scotia, in New Brunswick, in Prince Edward Island, or in Newfoundland and Labrador, almost all of them. The major Canadian law firms, the major firms from Toronto did send down teams to recruit the better students who some of them ended up going back to Ontario. So it's possible to do that. But if you're an Ontario law firm, and let's say you're not a large Ontario law firm, and most people, even though it's very prestigious to work at large law firms, most people work at small or medium-sized law firms. Those firms are not going to send teams of recruiters to different cities. So you're not going to see small and medium-sized firms sending teams, let's say from Toronto to Halifax, when you have law schools at U of T and at Osgoode Hall and at Ryerson that have ample numbers of students who are educated in Toronto who are able to work right away, right? So you have to think about that. So if you are dreaming of studying international law and you want to attend a school, let's say overseas, you have to think about, what is my ability to work in that area? Do I have the network that will allow me to go on to do that? Do I have the work visas that will allow me to do that? Am I complicating things or not? So generally speaking, the rule is that the closer you are to where you want to work is where you would ideally want to go to school. But it doesn't always have to be like that. Law school is extremely competitive, and you can go to law school in British Columbia and work in Ontario. You can go to law school in Nova Scotia and work in Manitoba. There are all kinds of different combinations that work, but you also have to think about the type of law that you're learning. So in Canada, you're learning Canadian law, and even though there are some differences in terms of provincial laws, the criminal code in Canada is the criminal code in Canada. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If you're studying in the United States, you're learning American case law, and you're learning about their constitution. And you can certainly learn about all those things in a bar admissions course, but it's going to be more difficult. So a lot of my colleagues who studied at McGill for law school went on to write the New York bar examination, which is a very prestigious bar exam to write. And they had to learn all the American law over the course of their bar exam, which can be done. And there are courses where you can do it. But if you want to work in Ontario and you're studying at U of T, or you're studying at Osgoode Hall, or you're studying at Ryerson, you're actually learning that law. And it's much easier to write the bar exams for the Law Society of Upper Canada, which is the law society in Ontario, than it would be, let's say, coming from somewhere else. So you have to think about all those things. So I know that's a very roundabout answer to your question, which is very complicated. It's always context dependent, but you always have to think through those variables before you make a decision like that.
And I think our last question, because we have about 4 minutes left, one of our attendees asked, would you recommend applying to an international law school directly from high school as opposed to finishing an undergrad first and then JD?
So it really depends. So there are some systems, like in the UK, where students go directly from high school into a professional program. So in medicine, as an example, people will typically take, they'll be accepted into medical school, but they would take a longer path to get in. So they would take a couple of years, let's say, as a more or less like an undergraduate student learning basic sciences, then they would go directly in. So in certain situations, students are trained to do that. So in the UK, students are not applying necessarily just for undergraduate programs. You're applying to get into, let's say, a law degree at Oxford right away. You'll go directly into that program. It's a little bit different than medicine, but it's directly into those programs. Right? So you're competing against students who have been trained to think in that manner. So in Canada, we don't have direct entry programs. Generally speaking, there are a couple in medicine, like quorums for Queens, where you would do a couple of years of undergraduate, and then you would be automatically accepted into medical school. But in law school, you need a little bit of undergraduate training. So in Canada, the process is that most students are applying for an undergraduate university education. So you could certainly do that. I find that, especially in the UK, the process of getting into a school like let's say Oxford or Cambridge, extremely difficult. You have to start planning for that years in advance. Those are very, very, very competitive applications to get into schools like that. So you really have to ask yourself at the end, why are you applying to those particular schools? If there's a legitimate reason, then go for it. But you're also working with students who, let's say, have a different headspace because they're thinking about professional school maybe earlier. In Canada, most students are thinking undergrad first, then university education. You have to think about the support system that you have there and how nurturing that's going to be, because usually you're a long way from home, what the language is going to be, and what your job prospects are afterwards. You also have to think about what the requirements are on the Canadian side. So this can change every year, and obviously you need to know, but you can't predict necessarily what the requirements are going to be and how they'll change over the years. So you have to see that your law degree is going to be accepted, let's say in Canada, if you choose to come back. So it can always be a little bit tricky. You really have to know what you're doing, and you may have to do additional training. So again, this changes from year to year, but one of my colleagues, who a really smart person, I studied at McGill with him. He went on to do a master's degree at the Sorbonne, the University of Paris. He did a law degree at Oxford University, very impressive place. And when he wanted to come back to Canada, they said, you have to do 1 year of law school in a Canadian school. So he said, I don't really want to do that. I'm going to do my extra year in the United States, and I'm going to practice in the United States. But he could not go on to practice in Canada without taking a little bit of training in Canada. That may have changed, but that was certainly the case. I was shocked at the time, because here was someone who went to some of the best schools in the world, studied law at a very, very, very high level, and they said you need at least 1 year of Canadian law. So you have to check that really, really carefully, and those can change over time.
All right, thank you. Do you have any final advice for any of our attendees, just really quickly, before we end it off?
Sure, it's just to really to be yourself, and there's no one specific path to getting into law school. As I've showed you, there are generalizable paths. It's like climbing to the summit of a mountain. Ultimately, you're trying to get to the same goal, but there are lots of different ways to get there. Just be true to yourself. Choose activities that really will bring out those transferable skills in you, and don't be convinced that there's specifically one way or another way to get there. Choose the courses that you really want to study that will put you on that path. Choose the activities that you really want to do that will help you to get up that mountain and to the summit. That's really the best advice. So be true to yourself, know what the obstacles are, but make sure that you're choosing activities that will speak to your personal brand and your narrative, because that's really the only thing that's going to set you apart from everybody else who wants to get to the same goal.
So thank you so much once again, Dr. Astroff, for taking the time to tell us about the process of law school admissions. We hope you guys all got your questions answered and have a better idea on what it takes to apply to law school and how to start preparing and thinking about it right now.
Great. Have a wonderful day, and thanks again for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.